All right. Good evening, everyone. It's about 7:01, so we'll go ahead and get rolling. I see some people are still coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started just to honor everyone's time. Welcome to our Indigenous Peoples Day webinar in honor of Indigenous communities and their connection to the environment. My name is Reagan. I use she, they pronouns. I'm currently a master's student at the University of British Columbia studying urban forestry. I'm calling in today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam people, or so-called Vancouver, British Columbia. Just so you all are aware, this webinar will be recorded and posted on Field Inclusive's YouTube channel. So be sure you follow us there for easy access to these recordings again and to past webinars as well. Also, to those who stay tuned for the entirety of the webinar, we'll be entering you in our giveaway for a chance to win a signed copy of Dr. Emanuel's book On the Swamp. 2 copies are available tonight, and the winners will be announced at the end. Shortly, I'll introduce our guest, but before we do, I just want to take a moment to share that Field Inclusive relies on the generosity of our community to continue offering programs like tonight's webinar. If you'd like to support our mission of amplifying marginalized voices and creating more inclusive outdoor experiences, you can do so by donating to Field Inclusive, or you can become a sponsor. And we've got some links for some information there in the chat. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ryan Emanuel. Ryan Emanuel is a hydrologist and community engaged scholar from North Carolina. He studies water resources, environmental justice, and Indigenous rights at Duke University, where he's an associate professor of hydrology and program chair for community engagement and environmental justice in the Nicholas School of the Environment. Dr. Emanuel's research group conducts field experiments and computational analyses while often partnering with Native American communities and tribal governments to understand global change through the lenses of environmental justice and Indigenous rights. Their collective work aims to amplify voices of Indigenous peoples and marginalized groups who shoulder heavy environmental burdens. Dr. Emanuel has published dozens of articles on topics ranging from hydrology, climate science, and ecology to environmental history and research ethics. His book, On the Swamp, Fighting for Indigenous Environmental Justice, was published in 2024 by the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Emanuel is an enrolled citizen of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. Tonight's webinar will be a conversation with themes from Dr. Emanuel's book, On the Swamp, and will be moderated by myself. We'll have time for pre-submitted and live audience questions. Please join me in welcome Dr. Ryan Emanuel. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Reagan. I appreciate that invitation, and thanks to Lauren as well, and to Field Inclusive for making this space available for our conversation tonight.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. Thanks for joining us. I'll just get the ball rolling. I just want to see, if there's any information you'd like to share beyond your very stacked, your very loaded introduction, very accomplished, but anything else that stands out to you that you're currently working on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm glad that you mentioned Duke's Community Engagement and Environmental Justice program. That's part of our Professional Master of Environmental Management program. And last spring, we graduated our first cohort of students from that concentration. And I'm just thrilled that it's an option that's available to our students now. And I do want to acknowledge also that I co-chair that program with Liz Shapiro Garza, who's an amazing colleague at Duke, who happened to be on sabbatical last year. So I was the sole chair last year, but I'm back
Wow.
in the co-chair seat now.
Fantastic. I'm sure that's such an accomplishment, but I'm sure it's such a weight off at some point too. That's really fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that program is going really well. I'm curious, if any of your personal experiences have influenced, working in that role, and maybe your connection to your homeland, influencing your perspective on working in that program, but also all of your broader environmental and just social justice work.
Yeah, my environmental justice work is filtered through the lens of my lived experiences as a Lumbee person. And even though I did not grow up in our homelands, I spent a lot of time there throughout my life, and I continue to do so today. So it's a very important place to me. And it's also a place where I see a lot of challenges and I see a lot of opportunities for change. So unlike some people who enter environmental justice, maybe through some scholarly discipline, which is great, and we need people to do that. I came to it through this other path of observation and reflection on what I saw happening in my homelands.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very interesting. Yeah, there's such an interesting distinction, especially between like the academia side of environmental justice and then the actual like on the ground work. Um, how do you see, I guess in that vein, how do you see environmental justice and indigenous sovereignty being linked? Like how do you see that connection and like how do you apply it?
Yeah, environmental justice is searching for the meaningful involvement of everybody in environmental decision making. And, what we mean by meaningful can vary from one situation to the next. And so this is where the idea of indigenous sovereignty comes into play. Sovereignty is inherent to indigenous communities, and it means that they were here and governing themselves prior to colonization. And one facet of that self-governance is to understand the indigenous people made and continue to make decisions about what was best for their communities and for their relatives, human and non-human. And today, in the 21st century, respecting Indigenous sovereignty means to acknowledge that Indigenous people really do know how best to take care of themselves in the places that they belong to. So meaningful involvement for Indigenous peoples might include allowing Indigenous people full control over environmental decisions in their homelands. And, that's a really tall order and it's impractical in many circumstances. And so there are often negotiated compromises that allow for some degree of Indigenous decision making and control, but maybe they don't qualify as full control. And so to me, there's this tight connection between this principle of meaningful involvement and what we mean by Indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. Can you can you share examples where indigenous led approaches to land and water stewardship have succeeded and kind of what we can like potential case studies, I guess, of what you've seen where that environmental justice and indigenous sovereignty are linked and how it's worked in the past and potentially what lessons we can learn from that.
Yeah, there are a lot of great examples that we can draw from many different places. And some of the high profile ones today have to do with things like dam removal in the
Yeah.
Pacific Northwest to restore salmon habitat and to restore fertile farmlands and things like that. But I'm gonna jump right to an example from the book. So I have a whole chapter in On the Swamp that's dedicated to the Coharie tribe. That's a tribe here in eastern North Carolina, and their work to restore their ancestral connections to their river, the Great Coharie River. And over the past decade, Coharie people have had this community-based initiative to make the river navigable again by canoes and kayaks, to make it accessible to all the people in their community and even to guests who come into their community, so that everybody can experience the qualities of that river. It's restorative qualities. It's natural environment, the peace that it offers. And they did that largely through their own self-determined volition. They weren't always working with the blessing or authorization of the state of North Carolina, who ostensibly manages much of that land. And one of the things that it teaches us is that environmental restoration is not necessarily a set it and forget it process, and it's
Right.
not necessarily a hands-off process. And many of the folks in the audience tonight know this, but for a very long time, the conservation and restoration groups sought to exclude people from their long-term plans for managing land and water, right, for habitat or conservation or what have you. But this Cohary example shows that a healthy and a vibrant river and healthy and vibrant wetlands require constant interaction by humans. And I think that that's a really powerful example of an indigenous-led approach to stewardship that invokes their values and their priorities and their principles when it comes to bringing back that connection to their ancestral river. And I'm guessing that some people on the call tonight may even have paddled the Great Cohary River with folks from the Cohary tribe. And if you're out there, then you know exactly what I mean.
That's fantastic. That's really great. Yeah, I'm seeing a reaction or two. I feel certain that some people have joined in on that. I'm so glad that you mentioned your book, because that's what I was hoping to ask a couple questions about as well. So that was a perfect segue. I would love to know more kind of about your process of weaving together personal narrative and history, and your work as an environmental scientist as well, like on the swamp, kind of where those paths merged, and what your inspiration was. And I'm seeing the chat as well from Lauren. Yeah, please, just as a reminder to the audience, please feel free to submit any questions that you might have in the Q&A. But yeah, no, I would love to just hear more about your process with writing the book.
Yeah, thank you for using that term weaving. That's a very generous term to describe what often felt like a chaotic process. And I guess I will say that this was a new experience for me because I don't come from a book writing discipline, and I did not have teachers or mentors who had written um, books like this before, or books at all, right? I come from a journal article writing discipline. So I didn't have a lot of models for the process. I've read a lot of great books, but I didn't know how those books came together. And for me,
Sure.
I will say the book started as a collection of stories. And I'll say that there were certain stories that followed me into the book and others that stuck with me as soon as they happened. And when I say they happened, I mean in that approximately 5-year window that the book is encapsulated by, with the introduction and the conclusion. In both of those cases, I tried to at least write down a first draft of that story as quickly as possible. Like even before I outlined the book and knew what the themes were in the chapters, I just wanted to get these stories written down in some form or fashion so I could like capture the essence of those moments. And you know, a lot of them just kind of sat in folders waiting for the right time and place to pull them out and insert them and then write around them and use them to teach other lessons. And that's consistent with how I like to teach. In my classes, I try to use storytelling as a mechanism for bringing out certain themes that we want to talk about in class or concepts. And so I applied that to the book as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, the difference between journal article writing and creative prose is such a they're not the same in the slightest, but I'm sure that it's, I'm sure that that's a fun exercise to express that storytelling in various ways. Were there any like particular stories or memories that were your favorite to write about, or anything that like immediately jumped out to you that had to go into the book and had to make its way to the world?
I loved writing the ghost story at the beginning of chapter 4, the chapter on fossil fuel infrastructure. And I loved it because I remembered the spirit in which that story was told to me, and it was a spirit of resistance and rebellion when people were kind of down in the dumps about this large pipeline that was supposed to be a done deal coming into our community. This story started to circulate, and people sort of used it the telling and retelling of that story as an act of resistance. And I was thrilled to be able to talk one-on-one with the person with whom that story originated. And so I actually got to hear it firsthand uh, from her, and that made me all the more excited when uh, she allowed me to write that story down and include it anonymously, of course. But nonetheless, she thought it was appropriate to include in this particular chapter.
How special. That's really wonderful. Were there any that were particularly difficult to write that you still felt were essential for the book, of course, but anything that particularly challenged you?
Yeah, I would say there are two different categories of challenges. One category was um, stories that were intellectually challenging to write. And those are stories that set up and are surrounded by research and writing from other disciplines, primarily history, right? And I'm not trained as a historian, and I had to learn a lot about the practice of archival research and the process of writing as a historian. And so, an example of that intellectually difficult storytelling would be chapter one, which is really a chapter of history, um, and it's learning to read and write as a critical scholar. And so for me in the archives, that meant oftentimes reading between the lines because there is is very little said in North Carolina's early colonial records about Indigenous people. And so that was challenging intellectually. It was frustrating to hear stories of your ancestors told through this colonial lens that was often aimed at extraction and exploitation. It was that was incredibly frustrating. But then to kind of pull myself out and analyze this text and think about it critically, allowed me to get at, I think, some what turned into some interesting stories. And of course, I'm not the first person to have told stories like the one about the Bear River Indians and the complaint to the magistrate, right? That other people have written that story before, but it helped me to go into the archives and read that in the complainant's original handwriting. And, that gave me
Yeah.
the idea to view that story as a Karen reporting to the manager incident. Um, and yeah, so and I would say some stories were also challenging emotionally because they were powerful stories either in my life personally or to Lumbee people collectively. And two quick examples were the story in chapter two about the fire that burned Old Main and using that as a setup for cultural connections to place. That's a really important story to Lumbee people, and it features some really prominent people in our community, including Ruth Revels, who wrote that amazing letter to the newspaper explaining how Old Main belonged to Lumbee people, even though they did not hold the title to the building. And the second emotionally difficult story would be in chapter eight, Ms. Rosa's memorial service, just because that was a particularly impactful moment to me personally. But I thought it was important to tell those stories because there were lessons associated with them.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. I think that that's a really great distinction, especially between, intellectually challenging, but also like culturally and emotionally challenging. I'm really enjoying like hearing about your process and like kind of what like where you're pulling from to write this book. And I'm curious more about like kind of on the vein of storytelling. I'm curious about the role that storytelling and oral tradition has in preserving Lumbee identity, and kind of what your process was translating oral storytelling and like oral tradition into a written novel written book?
Yeah, so I drew on a couple of things. One sort of an intellectual resource that I drew on was a wonderful book about Lumbee people published in the 1970s by a Lumbee scholar and a non-Indigenous professor at UNC Pembroke called "The Only Land I Know." And that book was that was the only book about Lumbees that I knew of growing up, and probably
Wow.
one of the only ones it was the only book exclusively about Lumbees that existed for many years, at least that was
Yeah.
accessible to most people who are not anthropologists or ethnographers. And so I grew up reading this book, and it was just packed with stories, oral traditions, anecdotes about our people. It was just a really nice book to read in terms of a survey of our culture. And so that was an inspiration for me. But I also grew up listening to just endless stories told by my elders, great aunts and uncles, and their aunts and uncles. And they were oftentimes telling and retelling our family histories. And these included genealogies going back generations or migrations that we had made in the past. And when we made those visits to our relatives' homes, I, like most kids, I'd try to go outside and play, right? If it's summer or if it's daytime,
Of
go play
course.
in the yard, go play on the edge of the swamp. But a lot of those visits were at night, or in bad weather. And oftentimes I would just have to like sit on the floor and listen to the grown-ups talk. So I was just surrounded by these stories. And, I heard them told over and over again, and sometimes from different people giving their different perspectives on the same stories. Um, and so that really helped to wrap me in these stories. And I've always felt like I needed some way to channel them into a way that was instructive and maybe therapeutic for me. I don't know. But I knew from the outset, like going into this, that I wanted to organize the book around stories, and I didn't really understand this until I encountered the work of Brian Brayboy. And, and he's a Lumbee scholar who explained how storytelling is a form of theorizing. That I understood that stories could be the anchor of a book. And so at first, I wanted to compartmentalize those stories as interchapters, like in between sort of the academic meat of the book. You would have these little interludes or whatever.
Yeah.
But I read one of the interchapters for a writing workshop at the University of Virginia very early on. And I got feedback from this group that the inner chapter should actually be the book. And so they wanted those stories front and center. So those two experiences, like encountering the work of people like Brian Brayboy, and then getting this positive feedback about storytelling early on, kind of gave me the confidence that I needed to organize the book in the way that I did.
Wonderful. I'm wondering if did you feel like there was anything that was potentially lost? I hate to say lost, but I feel like is there a gap between oral storytelling and written storytelling? Like as you were kind of documenting things and planning everything out and trying to put down what you've heard into words.
Oh, of course. Yeah, and there's no way to capture the fullness of a story
Yeah.
that's been told to you, by several different people and from several different perspectives. Um, I mean, even if you wrote as the omniscient narrator, you would still miss the richness of the ways that people interpret those stories individually. And so, yeah, I wasn't trying to do that. I think what I was trying to do is just tell the stories in my own way, but in a way that resonated authentically with the people who read them.
That's a really, yeah, no, that's really interesting. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you for elaborating on that. I would love to know, just kind of uh panning back out, I guess, your title of the book, of course, being On the Swamp. How does the swamp reflect resilience and survival for the Lumbee people, and what is your, what is your connection there? What is the connection that you have to that?
Yeah, I picked this up in a few places in the book, and it comes as early as the introduction, where I make this analogy between our swamp and the notion of ecological refugia. And so
Mhm.
many of you know this, but refugia refers to um, microenvironments where species or entire ecosystems can survive when you have something major like climate change that drastically alters a landscape. And we see these in North Carolina, right? The high elevation mountaintops in the southern Appalachians are refugia for the vast spruce and fir forests that once covered much of the East Coast during the last ice age. And now those forests have retreated up into northeastern Canada, but we still have these little pockets of them. Or if you live out in the
Yeah.
Piedmont, we still have these tiny pockets of cove hemlock trees
Yeah.
that usually live high up in the mountains, but we've got these little microclimates where they've managed to survive. And so, I think about our river and those swamps as a cultural refugia, where our ancestors were able to survive the the changes of colonialism, right? And of course, we didn't survive them unchanged. In fact, our nation wouldn't exist as it does today if it were not for colonialism. Um, but at the same time, it gave us a place where we could survive and thrive. And so, in that respect, it's been a historical safety net to us. It's also been a historical privacy fence, right? Because for the early centuries of our colonial encounters, Europeans believed in humoric theory, like their health was guided by the four humors, right? And one of those was bile, the black fluid, right? And if they saw that water and associated it with the unhealthy humor, they would be reluctant to even go into those landscapes. Not to mention the fact that those landscapes, even today, are not easy to navigate if you don't have a working knowledge of where the channels are, how the floodplains connect to one another and lead you in or out of the swamp. Um, yeah, so it is not just a symbol of survival and resilience, but it's a very tangible reminder of the ways that that landscape protected and nurtured and really welded us together into a nation.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think I think you're in great company explaining it as a cultural refugia. I think that lands so well, like with me personally, and with a lot of folks, I'm sure, in our call, given a shared background in ecology. Um, I'm curious about any kind of, I have one, I guess, final question about the book. I'll let our audience ask questions about the book if they have some as well. But do you have any misconceptions in mind about Indigenous environmental advocacy that you were hoping that this book might dispel, or anything that you were hoping that this book might communicate about Indigenous environmental advocacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I would say that there is a uh, misconception that Indigenous peoples' landscapes are always pre-colonial landscapes, but that's not
Mhm.
always true, right? And we don't always want to go back to an environment that is pre-colonial. I think the important thing is to give Indigenous communities the freedom and the authority to choose the future trajectory of their landscapes and homelands, whether they're infused with colonial practices and infrastructure or not. I think that's their prerogative. And that may not be a popular opinion, but if we really do respect Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, we have to allow for that possible outcome if that's what a people want for themselves. And so that's probably the biggest one that the book tries to expand on and tries to explain head on. Other than that, I've already talked about this idea of uh, hands-off restoration, sometimes called fortress conservation. And I guess, we think of fortress conservation as practice of demarcating a conservation area and expelling humans from it. We think about that as something that often happens in the global south. But it's something that happens in different ways right here in North Carolina. And that's what the Coharie people experience when the riparian corridor, the floodplain surrounding their river, uh, uh, was used as a conservation easement by the state of North Carolina. It led to some complicated issues around land access that ironically they had not experienced when that land was previously owned by a paper company.
Wow. Yeah, no, I learned a lot in your response there. That was really fantastic. And I've really appreciated you sharing more about your book. And I think some folks might be excited to win some copies tonight. And I'm very excited to go back and look through it after what I've learned this evening. But I'm just gonna kind of take things on a broader perspective. I would like to soon turn over to audience questions, but I would love to just kind of expand what we've been talking about and kind of understand what you're thinking in terms of how Indigenous knowledge systems might be able to reshape how we define kind of conservation or restoration. And especially, I think a lot back to um, my undergrad education, being in conservation biology and just how like one way, one solution and like how kind of straightforward it seemed that some of the approaches were. And it's very clear that that's not, of course, the only way that we could go. So I am really curious how, those Indigenous knowledge systems can kind of change what we've learned and what we've learned is the kind of typical path of restoration or conservation.
Yeah, I think one important takeaway is that Indigenous knowledge is highly localized, right?
Yeah.
Because it originated in that place. It sprang forth from a particular geography. And that's, to me, it seems logical that we would use that knowledge um, in the foreground of our restoration practices, right? Why would you not use science that was born in the place that you're trying to restore to actually restore a place or to even think about what restoration means? So I think that that's an important lesson. And if we take that to heart, it means that we have to support efforts by Indigenous people everywhere to strengthen, rekindle, and preserve their own knowledge systems, right? Because
Yeah.
at this time, every Indigenous community, frankly, doesn't have the capacity to, you know, to step into that role of lead stewards to
Yeah.
restore or to caretake their lands and waters, right? So doing things that support Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination can also support things like conservation and ecological restoration, because those are actions that can help Indigenous communities bring those knowledge bases up to the level where they can actually be applied in tangible ways. And I don't mean that from an extractive sense where we want to cultivate Indigenous knowledge so we can harvest it and use it in other ways. We want
Right.
to cultivate Indigenous knowledge so Indigenous peoples themselves can apply it in the ways that they think is best for their communities and their human and non-human relatives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that that's a really important statement. Especially I feel like as we're talking more about Indigenous sovereignty and as it's becoming um, a more discussed issue. I think it's been very important for so long, but I think it's only recently that the general public hears a lot more about it. There seems to be trends of kind of pan-indigenizing things, and um, yeah, I think I really appreciate the hyper local emphasis, especially just as every patch of land is unique and every um, community is unique as well. How do you envision collaborations between Indigenous communities and scientists evolving in the near future, in the next few years, and um, in our lifetimes?
Yeah, this is something that I think about a lot, but I don't have a lot of good answers to this question, right? We do see good examples of practitioners and researchers co-producing knowledge and practices and methods with Indigenous communities. But we also still have a lot of extractive work that's happening, right? Where Indigenous
Yeah,
knowledge is being co-opted or stolen and used for the benefit of others. And so I'm I don't know what the prospects are for the future. One of the things that I teach in my classes at Duke is how to build and maintain relationships with communities.
mhm,
Because whatever this looks like in the future, if it's going to be successful, it's going to hinge on strong relationships between communities and institutions. I think that's the only way that we can move forward. So for now, I'm focusing on um, those relationships, how we can build and strengthen them, how we can repair the legacy of institutional harm that kind of haunts many of these interactions, and then kind of hope for the best.
absolutely. I think, and that was a great segue into my final question, which is what gives you hope for the future? What inspires you about the Indigenous-led environmental movements ongoing now and continuing into the future?
Yeah, it's actually quite similar to my last response, but I would say that the thing that inspires and gives me hope would be young people. And it's funny because adults always said that when I was growing up, and I thought that was so cheesy. But now I'm starting to understand what they mean. So, you pour your heart and soul and your resources into making sure that the next generation is equipped to do better than your generation. And once that's done, you hope for the best. There's a lot of work that you continue doing in the background, but at some point, you hand over responsibilities to that generation. And I'm hopeful because I see young Coharie and Lumbee and Halawasaponi people out there on their ancestral waters, paddling in canoes and kayaks. And I see young people speaking their ancestral languages all across North America and elsewhere. I see technology that makes it possible for Indigenous people to connect over large distances, even around the world, to share their stories, to discover what they have in common, and to build solidarity. And a lot of that is happening among young people. And all of those things give me lots of hope.
Incredible. That's really fantastic to hear, especially on a day like today. Thank you so much for answering all of my questions. At this point, I'm going to turn over to our Q&A, and I'm seeing a couple questions. I encourage the audience to continue submitting, and I'm really excited to ask these questions. Actually, our first one is from Katie. After your roles as a historian and social scientist, share stories in the book, how have those skills and processes carried over into your scientific work?
Yes, thank you for that question, Katie. I'm trying to use those skills principally to be a better communicator. I found that um, clear and precise communication. We always say that it's essential in our writing and our speaking, but I will say that we've devolved in scientific writing to a point where you have to be technologically proficient and proficient in very specific disciplines to kind of read and digest scientific articles. This I'm generalizing, right? But this is very common in many of our disciplines. And so I'm using my cross training in these other disciplines over the past several years to try and make my writing in my core discipline clearer and more accessible to people.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the question. Our next question is conservationists are beginning to recognize that Indigenous governance of land can provide better outcomes for biodiversity conservation in many parts of the world. What is your perspective on the land back movement and how might it work for the Lumbee people and more broadly in the US given the broader social context? Sorry, I lost my place in the question for a second.
Yeah, so I write just a tiny bit about this in the book, and land back is a movement that says you got to go beyond acknowledging that this is indigenous land when you give your land acknowledgement and actually give the land back. That's the extreme position of land back, but on this side of that position, there is a spectrum of perspectives on land back. That can extend from co-management all the way to the extreme of full indigenous control and ownership of land. And so I am a proponent of indigenous people gaining control over their ancestral lands. I think there are some examples. There are lots of examples of this happening within the United States. I was at the American Indian Science and Engineering Society conference last week, and I saw a talk by a PhD student at Berkeley who's cataloging and studying all of these land transfers that have happened I don't remember how many years, but she's got a huge database of these transfers and is studying the circumstances under which they took place and the environmental conditions of those properties and things like that. One of the big challenges that people have identified to the land back movement is similar to what I talked about earlier when it comes to capacity. Over many generations um, of disinvestment, discrimination, um, and efforts to assimilate indigenous people, you're in a situation today where a lot of communities don't have the collective capacity to act as stewards. So it's not going to work in many cases if you just hand a tribal council the deed to a property, right? I mean, yeah, there's something that would happen in that case, but it wouldn't necessarily be um, it wouldn't necessarily be the healthiest thing for a community or um, uh, for a land or a water to do that if we didn't have the capacity to steward and care for that land in an appropriate way. And so others have identified that challenge on a case by case basis. And then there was a story a few years ago by one of the Troyers. I think it might have been David Troyer, wrote about what it would look like to say give stewardship of national parks back to tribal nations. And if you haven't read that piece, I highly recommend it because Troyer paints this very realistic picture of what it could look like to have national parks. For there are national parks, everyone's national parks, just as they are today, but stewarded by indigenous people. And the vision is really cool, but it is also realistic about the capacity related challenges. For Lumbee people in particular, we did have a recent instance where an entity deeded, I think, more than 1,000 acres of wetland back to the tribal government. And as far as I know, that there are plans underway to come up with um, a management strategy for that property. But we're a good example of a tribal government that has emerging capacity in environmental affairs and natural resource management. Our Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources is barely 3 years old, something like that. And so um, we don't have a lot of experience um, managing properties that big, right? And we don't have a big staff or workforce that can be dedicated to that. So there are a lot of challenges, but we are seeing inklings of it here in North Carolina, like this land transfer that the Lumbee tribe was involved in recently.
Great. Yeah, thank you for your answer. That's a really interesting take on land back, and I'm excited to hear more on your thoughts on that. Our next question is, do you have advice for other scientists that want to move from the primary literature articles based on their own research and move to or at least dabble in more ecological history and or commentary and or storytelling?
Do it. Do it. It is so rewarding and liberating if you've been trained to write journal articles, to be able to write what you want to write in your own voice and not have to contort yourself to write a sentence in passive voice, right? I'm being a little bit facetious, but I'm serious about doing it. You can start small, find an outlet like the conversation to target a piece. If you want to write creatively or write long form or write a book, um, find a good editor. I was privileged to find the editor for my book back in 2016. He literally grabbed me by the elbow after a talk at an ethnohistory conference and asked me if I wanted to write a book with him. And we worked together from that time onward. And he just provided so much insight and guidance on the process. I also took a week-long nonfiction writing class one summer that was aimed mostly at journalists. So these were primarily early career journalists looking to build up their storytelling skills. And I learned a tremendous amount from that class. So there are all of these professional practices that we can get involved with to to explore that side of writing. But I love the process, and I definitely encourage other people to write.
Amazing. I have two more questions from you from the audience. This next one is, how do you navigate different priorities between tribal and academic partners when pursuing a collaboration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I try to understand expectations early on in the process of forming a collaboration, and if those priorities are not compatible with one another from the get-go, I'm not gonna pursue that collaboration. Now sometimes priorities can shift midstream, and that's a different circumstance, but we can avoid a lot of these situations just by communicating clearly at the outset about what kind of deliverables does a university expect? What is the timeline that the university allows um, for a project or a funder allows for a grant? Clearly articulating those constraints, those expectations, and those requirements to the community, and clearly understanding the community's priorities. What are the deliverables that they want to get out of this? What are the resources or the capacity that they're hoping to have from that collaboration? And yeah, it is a process of communication. and making sure that all the cards are on the table early on.
Great, thank you. My last question for you from the audience is, do you think the state could take a beginning step toward land back by just permitting Indigenous people to freely access, not manage, their historical homelands that are currently held by the state? And has the state of North Carolina been open to those types of dialogues?
I certainly think that that is a good first step. And there has been legislation introduced in the past that would do things like make it easier for members of tribes in North Carolina to access uh, land for hunting, for example. To my knowledge, none of those bills have passed, but at least lawmakers are thinking about this issue. They're not thinking about it of their own volition. They actually have politically engaged tribal members who are suggesting these kinds of steps to them. But I think it is a good first step, and it seems like North Carolina is open to at least conversations about that. Making it happen is probably a different story. I mean, we don't even have um, a state level policy on tribal engagement. So if we were going to have those kinds of conversations, we don't actually have a clear roadmap in North Carolina for how to have those conversations with tribes. We do benefit from having a strong Commission of Indian Affairs, which sits in state government and has representation from all of the tribes in the state. And for years, that's been the de facto way that North Carolina engages with tribes, is principally by going to this commission and saying, we're thinking about implementing a policy that does this. It's actually what happened years ago when North Carolina attempted to remove race and ethnicity from our driver's licenses. When they consulted the Commission of Indian Affairs, they learned that there's actually an epidemic of misidentification of Indigenous people in vital records. And a lot of it comes from not having their race and ethnicity printed on their driver's license. That's a really weird example of tribal engagement leading to an outcome. But if you look at your driver's license today, whether or not you have something printed in that field, in North Carolina, there is a field for race and ethnicity. And the reason it exists is because tribes spoke up and said, no, we actually want you to leave this on here to make sure that if we're identified from our identifications that we're identified correctly. But outside the commission, there's not really a good mechanism for North Carolina to engage with the tribe on an individual basis to see what it might look like to grant access to their historical homelands that happen to be state owned.
That's a really great answer. I really appreciate you diving into kind of what that looks like in North Carolina. I think this was perfect timing. I really, on behalf of Field Inclusive and myself, I want to extend my sincere thanks for joining us today. I've learned a lot. I hope that our audience has learned a lot too. It's really, truly been a pleasure to chat with you. We're deeply grateful for the work that you do and for the generosity of you sharing your time and your work and your experiences with us. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our audience? Any way we can stay up to date with what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm not good about updating my website, but I do at least try to update a calendar of events on my website, which is just my name. I think Lauren's dropping it in the chat right now. So like if you actually want to follow along with what I'm doing related to the book or other kinds of outreach, that's probably the best place to find it. Please use the book if you teach or if you mentor others. I wrote the book so that you could use it to articulate the principles that we've been talking about tonight. Many libraries have free access to it. A lot of universities have free access to the ebook. Duke has access through our library, so check your library. Use that as kind of a first line if you're referring your own students to it. Yeah, so I want to see the book used in creative and productive and useful ways that keep this conversation going. And thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to chat with you and be with all of you on this Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emanuel. Thank you to everybody that joined us today. We will continue these conversations as we further our initiatives and work when it comes to amplifying social field safety. We have some winners for our anniversary giveaway. Congratulations to Mary Abrams and Kai Walton. If you're watching, please check the email you registered with so we can get you your giveaway prize. Yeah, thank you again so much to Dr. Emanuel. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day in America. Please be sure to follow and interact with us on all of our social media channels over at Field Inclusive. We've got Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, where you can watch recordings of this webinar and others at the handle @Field Inclusive for all of those. Please also be sure to visit our website to learn more about our organization and ways that you as an individual or an organization can support us and get involved. We hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again for joining us. Dr. Emanuel, hope you have a great night.
Thanks for all the work you do. Bye.